The Ys games have undergone many different evolutions during their lifetime. The series starting off with the incredibly acquired taste of the bump system combat before transitioning into the tri-magic system that is used in all of the Arc Engine games, and then most recently with the party system that Falcom have been pretty comfortable with. However, after 4 games using and refining this style, Ys 9 showed that it was beginning to overstay its welcome a little bit, and I know myself and many other long-term Ys fans were hoping for something new with the next game. And while Ys X Nordics doesn't exactly make any radical changes to the formula, it does have a very different feel to everything and shakes things up just enough to keep things new and fresh. For this entry, Falcom have foregone the parties of Ys's 7, 8, 9 and 4's remake Memories of Celceta and have instead opted for only having 2 playable characters. These being Adol, the series' main protagonist, and this game's newly introduced Kaja, a Norman and daughter to the leader of the Balta Sea Force, a group of Vikings policing the waters that Adol and co were sailing through at the beginning of the game, and for many mysterious reasons, Kaja and Adol find themselves tethered together, with the two of them only being able to be a few meters apart from one another, but said tether also granting them the ability to use mana, a power that allows them to defeat an otherwise unkillable type of monster known as Griegers. And so the two of them have to work together and set off to find out the mystery behind the Griegers, the tether, and this mysterious voice that they're hearing from a seashell. As always with the series, Ys X Nordics is a super easy jumping on point where you can join Adol the Red and Dogi the Wall Crusher on yet another journey, with this one adopting a pirate/Viking-like aesthetic, taking our favourite adrenaline junkie adventurer into uncharted waters, with brand new ship exploration and combat being this game's main hook and gimmick that's used in between the series' staple arcadey action RPG combat. And while said ship stuff definitely feels a little bit slow and basic at first, it's one that definitely delivers over time and feels a lot more inherently Ys than the previous game's urban exploration ever did. Skills from the party system games have returned, with various special moves being able to be performed by holding down R1 and pressing a face button. But it's this time round with the tether that connects Adol and Kaja that creates a paradigm shift compared to those previous titles. The 2 controllable characters are more like 2.5 all tied up into one, as Ys X has a very simple but elegant collection of combat systems that infinitely feed into one another. Instead of switching between characters to attack enemies with the right rock paper scissors damage type that is most effective against them, these two are both effective against everything, and so the game instead focuses on using them both together in tandem. This takes form in more obvious ways, like the duo mode, where you take control of both characters at the same time as a single unit and gain access to even more powerful skills that cost a ton of SP but also deal a ton of damage. But even when fighting separately, you'll be wanting to switch out back and forth repeatedly, because unlike the previous games, your 2 characters' SP meters are separate, meaning that you can cash out on one character's skills while the other's is recharging. And what really takes this up just another notch is that, providing that you don't spam your same skills over and over again, using multiple skills in relatively quick succession of each other will build up a combo, and that counter directly correlates to a discount on how much your skills will cost, creating a really good flow to combat as you pass the puck back and forth between Adol and Kaja. Doing this is not essential, at least on the lower difficulties, but it will allow you to build up more and more momentum, and when you're firing off on all cylinders, it just feels incredibly satisfying. Now, the defensive options of Flash Move and Flash Guard have been removed, or rather replaced, so if you are a fan of guaranteed crits during Witch Time, then I do have a little bit of bad news for you. The new options definitely seem a little bit automated at first, and to an extent they are, but there is a lot more going on with it than what it initially seems like. Firstly, while dashing and not attacking, Adol and Kaja will auto-dodge any sort of attack that has a blue flash on them, usually a projectile of some kind. And if you press attack while you're doing this auto-dodge, you'll do this big slash that is a great way to start off a combo when approaching an enemy. It's simple but effective of being just a very nice, fun, visceral way to initiate combat. The parry, however, is where things start to shine a little bit more, as it ties directly into that duo fighting stance. Essentially, if you're not performing any actions during duo stance, you will block every incoming attack. Some you'll just guard against. Others will chip away at your health, and some will break your guard entirely. Doing it at the last second, however, will allow you to do a big counter hit that will not only do a good chunk of damage, but will also refill your SP meter, allowing you to really keep up the pressure. What's important about this guard, however, is that it fills up something called the Revenge Multiplier, which is a damage bonus that applies to you when you're in duo mode, which is something that you can choose to hold on to for just normal attacks, or something you can cash out to make the duo skills even stronger than they already are. What really ties all of this new stuff together though is actually Falcom's new engine. While I absolutely adore Ys 8, I did always find myself enjoying the actual combat of Memories of Celceta a little bit more, as the fully 3D Ys games tended to feel a little bit loose and slippery. A lot of attacks didn't quite have enough oomph to them for my personal taste, and there'd often be moments where you'd do an attack or a skill while sprinting or immediately after a dodge where your character's feet would be firmly planted in the grass but they'd be sliding across it like ice. It's essentially the opposite problem that the Mortal Kombat games have. It wasn't enough to ruin the games for me or anything, I still bloody love them, but I definitely appreciated the new feel of this new engine. Everything feels just a little bit tighter without feeling stiff. And between stuff like this and a new tagging in attack that is used when switching characters mid-combo, and stuff like clear indicators of what special properties a skill might have, such as launching or knockback or iframes or a vacuum effect, it means that as a casual or normal player, you're much more able to better understand how each of these skills are actually meant to be used and string them together in various fun ways to make whatever combos you want to. We're not exactly talking Devil May Cry or anything here, but there is definitely enough depth in the game's combat to allow for player expression if you want to engage with it on that level. Something that the other games definitely had too, but to a much less obvious extent. Now all we need to do is solve the mystery of what the hell Kondo-san meant when he said that this game was going to be more like Dark Souls, because I haven't got a bloody clue what he's on about. The man works in mysterious ways. The other half of the game's core gameplay is the ship's sailing and combat, which also ties into the explorational parts of the series and really puts the adventure into action-adventure. It definitely doesn't feel anywhere near as refined as the normal hacking and slashing you'll be doing, as it's not had the same number of games to iterate off of. And it's likely a gimmick for this game and this game only. It is, however, more than good enough to be very fun in the short bursts that the game presents them to you in, and it inherently feels very easy. There's just something about sailing on the high seas, looking for new beaches or harbours to dock at, whilst also searching for various secrets hidden out in the water that I can only really describe as vibes. It has a certain je ne sais quoi. I think the go-to comparison point that most people will point to is Assassin's Creed Black Flag, and the gameplay loop is very similar. But I think, like what Ys 9 did to the sort of open world, city, superhero genre, Ys 10 also seems to do with this, and it feels like a very streamlined version of the Black Flag formula with a lot of the fat cut out of it. This works both for and against Ys 10, as it definitely feels a little bit slow and basic at first, as you have a weak long-range cannon that can slow enemies down and a short-range barrage that will destroy most ships in one hit. Pairing this with just how agonizingly slow you move at the beginning, you don't really get the best first impression. If you beeline the main plot a bit though, you'll very quickly gain access to speed upgrades, wind tunnels, extra boosts, and a whole host of different ammunition types. And once it started to open up, I really began to click with it. Once you get further into the game, the ocean map really opens up with multiple islands that you can land at to explore and continue your usual adventuring, but there are also several forts that have been commandeered by the Undying Fleet, which you can raid by breaking a barrier around it at sea and then finally storming inside on foot. This is essentially Ys 10's equivalent to the village raids in 8 and can be replayed at any time for better better ranks and items, some of which being really useful finite upgrades. And this, alongside stuff like boat boarding, is where the comparisons to Black Flag really come into play. It ultimately does still feel like Ys at its core, but it definitely takes that Black Flag gameplay loop that made that game so addicting, and that's not something I'm going to complain about. Sadly, however, there are no sea shanties while sailing about, so I guess I'm docking like 6 points for that alone. The best part about it, however, at least for me, is that the ship basically acts as the equivalent to the Ys 8 Castaway Village or the Ys 9 Dandelion Bar, as it acts as your sort of home base hub area. But more importantly, as you progressively go through the game, completing side and main quests, you'll slowly add more and more members to the crew and expand the ship in various ways. There's just something inherently satisfying about seeing your barren, rundown, decrepit old ship that you barely got afloat when you first set sail out onto the water with it, getting more and more crew members and renovations, making it look really fancy and nice. It just gets them dopamine receptors buzzing, and unlike the last two games, it's something that you actually bring with you, so those upgrades feel significantly more substantial. One thing I will say is that I do wish that the more basic upgrades that you just buy with money and resources actually reflected on your ship too. Just stuff like attack upgrades adding more cannons placed on your boat, or the speed upgrade giving you bigger, fancier sails, because the new crew members mostly affect the interior of the hull, and the outside doesn't really change all that much past a certain fairly early point in the story. I can see why they didn't do it, as having all of these different variables that can individually change means that there'll be a ton of combinations, and that equals a lot of money being spent to make sure the assets all work together well, and that's money that Falcom don't really need to be spending. Luckily, there are cosmetics that you can buy or find for your ship via doing side quests that will really spruce things up a little bit compared to the basic loadout, so in that sense, progress is still represented visually. That being said, my review code did come with all of the DLC, so I was kind of able to ruin that a little bit by decking my ship out with a ton of shit right off the bat. Speaking of money being spent, that is one thing the game really surprised me with. Falcom has a bit of a reputation for what I would call inexpensive game development. Assets, code, and art are often reused very frequently to save on cost and get a new game out every year, despite realistically not having quite enough staff to actually achieve that with. But Ys 10? Ys 10 has money. There are these big flashy animations that go off whenever you perfect parry a boss's unblockable attack, and there's actual set pieces in this game. Not many, mind you, but there are genuine moments that made me go, wow, Falcom, you're really kicking it up a notch this time. And while I was never wanting for things like set pieces in a Falcom game, it is nice to see them for a change. I've always said that one of the more charming things about Falcom is that you're always able to enjoy even the tiniest of budget increases. I'll mark out to a slightly more natural attack animation in Cold Steel 2, so you know I am popping off at a dynamic camera angle. And all of this is only elevated thanks to the new in-house engine that Falcom developed originally for Trails Through Daybreak. Since for the most part we've finally broken free of the visual look that we'd been using since 2013, on an engine that was most popular for the Vita. It's just really nice getting a whole package that looks and runs just so much better than before. It does look a fair bit more simplistic compared to Trails from Daybreak, as it was built with the Switch in mind instead of that port being a fairly ugly afterthought. But I don't think it ruins the look of things per se. It gives the game a sort of painterly feel to the visuals, and ends up feeling more like a visual choice than a cutback, even if it is probably a little bit of both. The other benefit of this is it makes the PC version far less taxing, which is great for me because it's how I've been playing it. And thanks to PH3's work, it's still super scalable, so if you do happen to have a brand new modern PC, you'll actually be able to use all that extra horsepower on something. Be it an incredibly nice anti-aliasing method, super high frame rates, or boosting stuff like shadow quality so high that you start getting negligible improvements, but hey, it's an option. Something I also appreciated was that there was an option to show a single rendered frame while changing each of the settings in the menu, so you're able to switch back and forth and actually see what the difference in visuals your changes are making. The game still looks pretty good on lower settings, so it's not that bad if you have a weaker machine, but from my experience I was able to just max out everything with the exception of anti-aliasing, shadows, and maybe volumetric lighting depending on the scene. While there are definitely better options, I would probably recommend the default anti-aliasing, especially if you're running above 1080p, since MSAA can get very expensive the higher res you are. And if you're not happy with how many jaggies are on screen, it's actually probably better just to bump up the rendering scale a few notches. This is technically more expensive, but you don't have to go all in like you do with MSAA. You can just do it a little bit. For shadows, I would suggest either the medium or high settings with the soft filter, or the high with the default filter. Naturally, if you have the juice, then by all means bump it up to ultra, but do be warned that it's pretty pricey, since on top of increasing the shadow resolution, it also pushes out the LOD settings for those shadows, so even at a distance they'll be high res. The PCSS shadow filter is a really high-tech one that looks really good in most games, as it mimics real life, making shadows look blurrier the further away they are from the object that's casting them. Unfortunately, however, I can't recommend it, because on top of it being quite expensive, it doesn't seem to like to play nice with Falcom's new engine, because I've noticed stuff in both this game and in Daybreak where character shadows look kind of funky around their ankles. But yeah, that was just a little PC port report for you. The last little bit I want to talk about is the story, but more specifically the characters, since I don't want to give too much away as to not spoil you on everything. For starters, this is an Ys game, so the story's not necessarily the focus, so don't go in expecting this grand narrative experience. That being said, however, it is still a very good one. And while I don't think it quite reaches the level of Lacrimosa of Donna for me, it's still one I've been enjoying a lot. And part of that reason is thanks to the cast. Kaja was a character I wouldn't say I was worried about per se, but I wasn't really expecting much from her either. Luckily, I was really pleasantly surprised. The Balta Sea Force are Vikings, they're bandits of the sea, and I really like how even when depicting them as these noble warriors, for the most part, Ys X doesn't shy away from showing them as the brigands that they are, at least in the beginning. Because as for Kaja, when you first meet her, she can come across quite abrasive. With moments like a man asking us to rescue his daughter, and Kaja telling him that we'll slay the monster, but whether or not his 8-year-old daughter survives is up to her, as if to say lol skill issue to some kid running away from a monster. But afterwards, you get to see what choosing to survive means as part of the Norman code of life, and that Kaja's not necessarily this cold-hearted ice queen, but just has a fundamentally different view on how the world works, and once you take that into account, and once she starts softening up to outsiders a bit more, she's a character that I believe works really, really well. And one who has an incredibly good character dynamic with Adol, which really says a lot about her writing, but also about Mr. Christin's as well. I absolutely adore how Falcom has really started leaning in on this aspect of Adol being a little bit of a freak when it comes to adventuring. Previous games would have the occasional snarky dialogue option, or a moment where Dogi would have to tell Adol to calm down because he's getting excited and shaking over the idea of being attacked by dinosaurs. And these moments really helped sell the idea that Adol was not just a silent protagonist for the player to project themselves onto, but they've really cranked up just how much personality shines through in this game. They're not all insane off-the-wall prompts or anything, but Adol has a lot more options in this game where you can pick between being nice and polite or making those around you a little bit concerned. And I know I'm a little bit biased, but I really enjoy this and really think it helps alleviate some of the downsides of having a silent protag. As for the rest of the core cast, they're all just really nice to hang out with, for a lack of a better way of describing them. Going into a ton of detail for each of them would really just drag out the end of this video, and I think it would just be better for you to go and play the game yourself, but there is just something about this cutscene where they're all welcoming Adol and Kaja into their little friend group that really just had me smiling from all the cozy vibes going on. And if that's not a good sign, I don't know what is. Ys X Nordics is a great return to form after a pretty wide swing from the previous game, and I had a ton of fun being able to get back into true adventuring with Adol again. Nihon Falcom have always been consistently good with the Ys series, and that hasn't changed here. And while I would have perhaps enjoyed them shaking things up just a little bit more than the remixed ideas of the old party system, the in-house built game engine and the game's new ship combat has made Ys X feel like a familiar but ultimately refreshing new entry in the series, and I really hope people will pick it up despite the incredibly packed season of games that are releasing right now. Oh, and the music is as based as always, nothing quite on par with Occlusian Dance though.